Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Contagion Cultures webinar on Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020, Election Day in the US. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, inaugurated here in 1841 by Queen Victoria. Queen's University is both an institution of higher learning and also an imperial project. We're grateful to learn and work here, and we need to remember and learn from this history and this reality. I hope that we strive for restitution for wrongs against Indigenous and other people that continue to this day. I hope that our series, which aims to incorporate and further various ways of thinking about how to best live with all of the planet, works in this direction. Contagion Cultures is a Faculty of Arts and Science collaboration between the School of Public Policy Studies and Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, with Queen's Library providing substantive support. The 50-minute talks are live streamed, or sessions are live streamed at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesdays. We hope that audience members pre-register, join us each week, and help to promote the series widely. The talks are available online, will be archived in the Queen's Library, and we particularly hope that these original contributions by Queen scholars will be deployed in courses. Contagion Cultures Lectures helps make sense of this pandemic through the expertise and insights of arts and science faculty members. This public-facing series leverages the powerful tools of humanistic analysis to grapple with our turbulent times. For the audience, please submit your questions in the Q&A. You can find it at the bottom of your screen in the middle. If you can't see it, then hover your mouse over that portion of the screen and it'll come up. As webinar attendees, you're both invisible and muted, and we welcome your typed questions that we'll field after about a 30-minute talk by my guest today that I'm very excited to introduce with a just fabulous topic. Her name is Jenna Healey, and Jenna is an assistant professor of history and the Jason A. Hanna Chair in the History of Medicine at Queen's University, where she's responsible for integrating the humanities into the undergraduate medical curriculum. She's cross-appointed in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the Department of History. Jenna received her PhD in the History of Science and Medicine from Yale University in 2016. Her research interests lie at the intersection of gender, race, and medical technology in the 19th and 20th centuries. Her talk today is entitled Racism, Scapegoating, and Blame in the History of Epidemics. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jenna. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me and for inviting me to be part of this Contagion Culture series. It was such an excellent idea, and I'm glad that we're sort of reflecting on the relevance of our current moment, even as we're experiencing it. So I'm going to just set up my PowerPoint here. So my topic today is racism, scapegoating, and blame in the history of epidemics. And it really is sort of a bird's eye view of this pattern that we see throughout historical epidemics, which is sort of a tendency towards finger pointing, particularly finger pointing towards racialized populations or marginalized populations. And I start this with this photograph that will look familiar to a modern eye. This is a group of Japanese school children in 1918 wearing masks. And of course, we've become very familiar with images like this in our own lives, with our own children wearing masks to school. And I'm starting with Spanish flu, or the 1918 influenza outbreak, because I think it is the sort of most immediate, obvious example that we can compare our current moment to. And I think when COVID-19 first hit, there was a lot of comparison in between the Spanish flu and our current moment. So where did the Spanish flu originate? This is often one of my favorite facts that I like to tell students when I'm teaching them the history of medicine, though I suspect it's actually much more widely known now after sort of the attention that the influenza has received in the media in the past 12 months or so. Well, I guess it hasn't been 12 months yet, about 9 months. So the name Spanish flu is a bit of a misnomer. The reason why it's labeled as the Spanish flu is not because the flu originated or the virus originated in Spain, but because Spain was a neutral country during the First World War, which is the sort of the context that is behind the entire outbreak and the entire pandemic. And they did not have censorship in their newspapers. And so they published widely accounts of the virus as it was spreading through their country. Other countries, like the United States and Britain, who were participating in the war, actually censored accounts of the outbreak at first because they did not want enemy forces knowing that they were being crippled by the outbreak of a virus. And now there was multiple waves of the Spanish flu. I won't get into some of the details, but by the second wave, which was in the fall of 1918, that sort of censorship was lifted, but the sort of name Spanish flu stuck. Now, we do see a little bit of what I would call Spanish scapegoating during this outbreak, in that often when we see depictions, especially sort of cartoons of the Spanish flu, it will be personified as a sort of a matador or some sort of stereotypical Spanish figure. And so here we see a cartoon from the Los Angeles Times on October 12, 1918, in which we see this image, this figure of a sort of a matadorian influenza virus with a sort of exaggerated mustache, saying, "How do you ka-choo," which I suppose is a sneeze joke. And the rest of the comic, the man in the photograph is actually the health commissioner of Los Angeles at the time, who was being sort of critiqued for his response to the virus. Maybe that sounds very familiar as well. And then we see the different sort of reactions, and one of them I like is the school kids' view. They're very excited that school is canceled, versus the movie theater owner is very upset that their movie theaters are being closed. So a lot of echoes of what is happening. The only place that the Spanish flu wasn't called the Spanish flu was, of course, Spain, because they sort of rejected the idea that they were responsible or that the virus originated there. And it was actually quite common in Spain to call the disease instead the Naples soldier, which is actually a reference to a popular song from a musical at that time. And people said that the flu was so catchy, just like that song. And so it was sort of a dig at Italians as opposed to the Spanish. So the one reason why, I mean, there's lots of reasons why the Spanish flu reminds us of our current moment, and there's lots of lessons to be learned. But I actually think it's one example in which there is probably less scapegoating and blame and targeting of racialized populations than we see in other epidemics. In part, that was because the virus was spreading basically through the movement of troops and soldiers, many of whom were returning home to war in the fall of 1918 after the Allied victory. And so this is a photograph from early 1918 of influenza patients at Fort Riley in Kansas. There's some theories that this is where the Spanish flu actually originated. And because of the sort of social sort of atmosphere at the time, in which the returning veteran was to be hailed as a victorious hero, you couldn't really blame the soldiers for spreading the virus, even though it was quite obvious that they were the carriers of the virus and the ways that it spread so easily around the globe. And so we don't see a lot of discourse blaming returning soldiers who are heroes. And so scapegoating is very, it depends on sort of what the prevailing social attitudes about certain groups are, and we'll actually go out of our way not to blame groups if they are sort of social heroes in a different way, in this case, the returning soldiers. Before we get into we have two sort of case studies today to look at scapegoating and blame in the history of epidemics. I include this quote by a historian of medicine by the name of Charles Rosenberg. This has always been my favorite quote about the history of epidemics, and it has become extremely relevant. And this was originally written in response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. For the social scientists, epidemics constitute an extraordinarily useful sampling device, at once found objects and natural experiments capable of illuminating fundamental patterns of social value in institutional practice. Just as a playwright chooses a theme and manages plot development, so a particular society constructs its characteristic response to an epidemic. And I just love the idea of the epidemic as sampling device, because it really does lay bare all of the existing tensions and sort of divisions within a society. And we can absolutely say that we've seen that with COVID-19. So if a society is going to break a certain way, an epidemic will certainly reveal where those fault lines were. We won't actually get a chance to talk about HIV/AIDS today, but it's another excellent historical example of the way that scapegoating and blame work in the history of epidemics, particularly in the targeting of gay populations in North America and the sort of blame placed on them for the origin of that virus. So we wrapped up our introduction where I sort of introduced you to the idea of scapegoating in epidemics and the ways in which that played out in the Spanish or not so Spanish influenza. But I want to focus today on two other examples. The first is the Black Death or the Bubonic Plague as it spread through Europe in the 14th century. Now, I'm not a medievalist, I'm not a medieval historian, but this is such a clear example of the ways in which blame is appropriated in epidemics. And so Jewish populations in Europe were the subject of conspiracy theories that they sort of poisoned sources of water and caused that plague, and they suffered grave consequences and were in fact murdered en masse for their suspected involvement with the plague. So we're going to talk about that example first. The second example I chose is less about a specific disease and as a sort of attitude throughout the 19th century about immigrants, and particularly Asian immigrants in North America and their association with outbreaks of epidemic disease. As we see sort of large waves of immigration to the North American continent in the 19th century, immigration becomes very, very tied to disease, in particular communicable diseases like cholera or typhus. And in North America on the West Coast, both in the United States and in Canada, a lot of this focus was actually on Asian immigrants. There was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, and almost all of it was tied to ideas of health, to ideals of cleanliness or lack thereof. And there was a lot of inappropriate scapegoating of Chinese populations in Vancouver, in San Francisco, as well as in Hawaii that we will discuss. And I pick these examples because I think that has direct relevance to what we're seeing in COVID-19 with the scapegoating or blaming of Asian populations and the sort of increase in incidences of harassment. So in my conclusion, I'll bring that back to COVID-19 and we'll talk about the ways in which racism and sort of racist blame has been playing out in COVID-19. So for our first example, which is about the Black Death and the anti-Semitism that animated a lot of responses to that pandemic. I don't know sort of what the background of a lot of the people on the talk is, so I'll just give a little bit of an overview of what this sort of very famous epidemic of the Bubonic Plague looked like. That's widely known now as the Black Death, though it had many, many names. My favorite was actually an Arabic name for the Black Death, which was the year of annihilation, which seems to apply to 2020 in some ways as well, but it's very appropriately dramatic. And so this outbreak was often thought to originate in Florence, so that is around 1348. And before we sort of get to the way it spread, I just want to call your attention to this image. This gorgeous image that was actually a watercolor from the early 20th century that is sort of looking back on this epidemic, and it's illustrating a lot of things about it. If you look at the top of the image, it actually depicts, I think, sort of a vengeful God, and we'll talk a little bit about the ways in which the epidemic was understood to be punishment for sin or some sort of divine retribution for sin. Throughout, we'll also just see various sort of treatments. So this vessel on the side, the blue vessel, that's a theriac. That would have been a specific type of treatment, therapeutic, that might have been applied to the bubonic plague. We see images of rats. And then on the left of your screen, I think, right, we'll see a few different executions. Those are a little bit historically inaccurate, but we see sort of people being blamed for various outbreaks of the disease. And so we see all sorts of both causation, reaction to the disease, as well as blame throughout this image. So as I mentioned, this particular outbreak that I'm speaking of began in 1348 in Florence and sort of spread throughout Europe. I like to show this animation in my lectures. It's a GIF. I never know what they are, but you just sort of see how it spread throughout Europe, and it was just absolutely devastating on a scale that is actually quite hard to comprehend. My students always are very observant, and they notice, well, what about Poland right there in the middle? And as far as I know, it was in fact a lockdown of the city, a quarantine that prevented the spread. And I doubt, this is based on historical data, that it was quite as neat as this, but it's a nice illustration nevertheless. So in order to help us grasp the sort of scale of this plague pandemic, I like to use some striking statistics. The first is 25%, which is a low estimate of the mortality of the European population over a 5-year period. So between about that beginning in 1347 and 1352, 1/4 of the entire population. And that's on the low end. It's possible that was higher. 50 million is the total number of estimated deaths worldwide, between the earliest deaths recorded in Mongolia in 1328 and the last in Moscow in 1353. So just an astronomical number of deaths. And now 20, sometimes I make my students call out what they think this number represents. I don't think this platform lends itself well to that, so I will just tell you, which is estimated to have been the average lifespan during the pandemic, which is a very sobering figure. Of course, this is all based on historical data. The best we know, the numbers, of course, there was no way to tell exactly what the numbers were or what the extent of the devastation was. So when we look at the sort of dramatic scale of this epidemic, we can only just imagine the fear and uncertainty. We've experienced it a little bit ourselves this year, but then sort of think about it as it intensifies on that sort of very, very large numbers. So how did individuals, physicians, and the state explain such a devastating event? How did they cope with it? What were the sort of mechanisms for making sense of it, and how did they necessarily tackle it? Because they were really quite helpless to stop the spread of disease. So there are about 3 categories of sort of explanations that we could point to for the plague during this outbreak. The first, and I think the most popular and sort of the most widespread, was this idea that this was some sort of punishment from God. And that was fairly consistent with other sort of medieval conceptions of disease as punishment, sort of relying on old narratives of leprosy as a marker of sin. And so we do see sort of movements. We see sects of Christians sort of flagellating themselves in order to sort of make up for their sin. We see public services in order for people to sort of beg God for forgiveness and have him stop the plague. So lots and lots of sort of biblical ideas about punishment and retribution. The second set of explanations would be maybe what we would think of today, though that's a little bit of a historical, to think of sort of scientific or medical explanations. Now, during this period in the 14th century, there were medical astrology was very, very popular. And so there was quite a prominent theory of the plague that said that there was actually a very unusual astronomical configuration, I think, of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus on sort of like March 8th, 1847 or something like that, in which that weird astronomical configuration created sort of a miasma in the atmosphere, which disturbed the earth and then created this disease. And so for sort of the more maybe learned members of society, this was a very convincing explanation because it did look to sort of the divine, but more to the natural world in order to explain the appearance of such a dramatic and devastating epidemic. But the last and really quite prominent way of sort of explaining what happened was to point fingers, and in particular, to point fingers at Jewish populations and in Europe. And now this, just as the quote at the beginning sort of indicated, marks the sorry, I just saw that there's questions in the chat. I actually can't see them while I'm sharing my screen. So just so people are aware that I will answer them at the end. So we have, there's theories that Jewish populations, because they were so segregated, probably on the whole were less affected by the plague because they may not have been mixing with society or in sort of in cities, they might have been ghettoized. And therefore, maybe if they had sort of lower rates of disease, people would become suspicious that they had something to do with spreading the disease. So anti-Semitic conspiracy theories really begin in earnest in France. And the idea is that there was a rabbi in France who sort of conspired with other sort of servants to poison wells in Italy and to sort of spread the poison that way, and that they sort of went to Venice first and then went to different cities and poisoned public drinking water with some sort of poison that created the disease. In autumn of, oh, sorry, that should say 1348. I apologize for that. There were many Jewish prisoners taken in France, and they were tortured until they confessed to the conspiracy. So we do have these historical documents that appear to be confessions, but we know that they were really taken under much distress. Germany is then the site of many massacres of Jewish people. At least 2,000 Jewish people were killed in Strasbourg and 12,000 in Mainz. So I have a few quotes here from primary documents from this period of time, and I want to give you a sense of sort of what scapegoating looked like in the texts of the time. So the first is actually this confession that I was speaking of that was made under duress. That date was dated October 10th, 1348. And this, of course, is a third party recording the confession, and we don't actually have the confession written by the man himself. They said, Adjumant took this package full of poison, and so this is sort of claiming what he's confessed to, and carried it with him to Venice, where he came there, and when he came there, he threw and scattered a portion of it into the well or cistern of fresh water, which was there near the German house, in order to poison the people who used the water of that cistern. And he says that this is the only cistern of sweet water in the city. He also says that the mentioned Rabbi Peret, who is mentioned earlier in the confession as sort of the major conspirator behind this plot, promised to give him whatever he wanted for his troubles in this business. And then the confession goes on to say that even though the rabbi told him to only poison this one well, he actually, on his way home, poisons every single well he sees, I don't know, just for the heck of it. So it's a very, very outlandish conspiracy theory, but on a sort of popular level, it was very, very widespread. And another sort of parallel of COVID that we see conspiracy theories spreading through the populace in order to sort of make sense of what's happening. So the next account is by a historian who witnessed the massacre of Strasbourg, of Jews in Strasbourg on Valentine's Day in 1349. He said, on Saturday, that was St. Valentine's Day, they burnt the Jews on a wooden platform in their cemetery. There were about 2,000 people there, I should say there. Those who wanted to baptize themselves were spared. Right? So we also see some of the religious discrimination here. Some say that about 1,000 accepted baptism. Many small children were taken out of the fire and baptized against their will of their fathers and mothers, which is just such a horrifying scene that's painting. And everything that was owed to the Jews was called, and the Jews had to surrender all pledges and notes that they had taken for debts. The council, however, took the cash that the Jews possessed and divided among the working men proportionately. The money was indeed the thing that killed the Jews. And so the reason I included this passage is it really speaks even to a contemporary observer of what was happening, that there was absolutely a political motivation behind this. This is not just something that anti-Semitism didn't just appear out of nowhere, right? They were being targeted because they, for the most part, were holding the debts of many people, and they wanted their money back. There was a lot of jealousy, sort of old anti-Semitic Semitic stereotypes. And therefore, there was this really a financially motivated crime. It's interesting in Strasbourg that the city council, when there were sort of riots in the streets pushing this conspiracy theory, the city council actually dismissed it. They said, we're not rounding up anyone in our city. It is not the Jewish population's fault. And actually, the townspeople then booted that city council out and elected a new one in order to sort of hold these events. And so even though the government actually sort of rejected the popular conspiracy theory, it still ultimately prevailed because it's sort of the panic of the people. Okay, I want to move into our second case study now, which is looking more at the 19th century and issues of sort of contagious disease as well as xenophobia and anti-Asian racism. So anyone who studies the 19th century knows that cholera was really the big, scary epidemic threat, particularly in the first half of the 19th century. This image I find striking. It is the victim of image of a cholera victim painted in England in 1832. And here we actually see watercolor being used to sort of depict the very characteristic blue cast of the skin. And it's a really very horrible death. It's spread through very crowded new urban environments quickly. And because of sort of growing globalization, colonialism, empire, and the movement of people, it spreads quite quickly across trade routes and among immigrants who are moving in and out of different countries. There are several waves of cholera, distinct waves of cholera that we can point to. The first three have a significant amount of mortality, both in Europe and in North America. The second wave is the one that's really the most famous, and 1832 is the year in which cholera was really at its peak in a lot of cities. This includes Kingston, actually. In 1832, 1833, it's estimated that probably about 10% of Kingston's population died of cholera. And the Kingston General Hospital is actually built on the mass grave of cholera victims from Kingston. So I'm sorry if you didn't already know that. So cholera is an interesting case because it was a very feared disease. It was very, very studied. And I think many of us have heard of the epidemiologist, not the Game of Thrones character, Jon Snow, who posited different theories of cholera in the mid-19th century and drew the famous disease map, right, which he identified that cholera was coming from a very specific water pump. So we do have all sorts of scientific theories about what causes cholera, but that does not stop people from sort of targeting immigrants and sort of pushing xenophobia as a sort of mechanism of blame for the spread of cholera. Even if we understand that it might come from contaminated water, that doesn't mean that contaminated bodies aren't also a threat. This image from the British satirical magazine Puck in 1883, the label is the kind of assisted immigrant we cannot afford to admit. And here is a skeleton supposed to represent cholera. And I don't know how well you can see this on your screen, but his waistband there is actually labeled cholera. And this is a very racialized image. It's an Orientalist image. He's wearing a fez. And very, very much supposed to represent cholera as a foreign threat. We actually see here the ship of the Board of Health sort of coming to shoot carbolic acid at the immigrant. So that's a type of disinfectant. And so they're seen as sort of this invasive threat of disease. And cholera was in the 19th century very often referred to as Asiatic cholera or Indian cholera because of theories that it originated in the Asian continent. So of the ways of immigration to North America in the 19th century, there were many Chinese as well as some Japanese laborers that were purposely recruited to Canada. And this was actually the brainchild of our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, in order to provide cheap labor to build the Canadian Pacific Railroad. That project is completed around 1885, but leading up to the completion of that project, we already see a surge of anti-Asian racism in Western cities, particularly beginning in Victoria in British Columbia. In the United States, in 1882, very similar anti-Asian sentiment in Western cities, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco especially. That sees the passage of the American Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which forbids the further immigration of any Chinese to the country. And Canada is sort of inspired by this, and so they start to investigate their own options. And they strike a Royal Commission on Chinese Immigration. And the report of that commission is this image that you see here. A huge part of this sort of anti-Asian sentiment relied on claims that Chinese immigrants were carriers of disease. And it's actually hard to overstate how important that connection was to justify the racism of those advocating for immigration restrictions. This is a quote from the report itself. It says, "The Chinese quarters are the filthiest and most disgusting places in Victoria, overcrowded hotbeds of disease and vice, disseminating fever and polluting the air all around." Now, there's a little bit of recognition here that the crowding and the housing conditions actually were related to the poverty of these people. And that was related to the fact that when they were laborers, they were paid a fraction of what a sort of a native-born Canadian would have been. So even though people make that connection and they can see that it might in fact be poverty causing higher rates of disease, they instead sort of essentialize it and blame it on Asian bodies. So throughout the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, we see repeated outbreaks of leprosy, smallpox, and syphilis on the West Coast that are always blamed either on Chinatown or on Chinese immigrants. And in 1885, Canada actually starts to put a head tax on all Chinese immigration, significantly slowing down its rates. So there were very, very similar narratives of blame and connecting sort of Asian immigration with disease in other cities. This is actually Honolulu, Hawaii in 1900. It's such a striking photo. There was an outbreak of the plague in Honolulu that year, and they actually burnt Chinatown to the ground. They started by just saying, well, they were clearing up the garbage. They started setting all the garbage on fire. You set all the garbage on fire in a 19th century city made of mostly wood. The entire neighborhood went up in flames, and over 4,000 Chinese residents lost their housing and lost their homes in the fire. So it was done under the guise of public health policy, getting rid of dirt, getting rid of garbage, but it was quite a punishment and really a targeted attack on that population. And closer to home, there are several anti-Asian riots in Canada, the most famous being the Anti-Asian Race Riot of 1907 in Vancouver, in which Chinatown was and businesses in Chinatown were viciously attacked by those advocating for immigration restrictions. And during the protests, one of the sort of chants or the reasons why they were doing this is because the neighborhood was supposedly filthy and therefore the root of epidemic disease. And this is such a striking photograph that was taken after the riots of a business very much destroyed by this sort of scapegoating of Asian populations. Now there are even more recent examples, right, of connecting anti-Asian racism in Canada specifically to the outbreak of disease. And of course, the most recent example we have is actually the Sars epidemic. This is an image, it's quite famous, of children at a ballet lesson in Hong Kong, all wearing masks. There's actually been a lot of interesting studies done by academics of the ways in which racism manifested itself during the outbreak of SARS, specifically in Toronto, a city that already had some sort of underlying racial tensions with large amounts of Chinese immigration to that city, particularly from Hong Kong at the end of the 1990s. We know that businesses in Toronto's Chinatown saw their revenues fall 80%. Many of them were forced to close. So there was a lot of discrimination being had in terms of patronizing businesses. And there's actually an interesting study that's been done to show that the Canadian media had an enormous bias, that every time they showed a picture of someone in a mask during the 2003 outbreak, it was almost always someone of Chinese descent. So they were very much trying to create this connection between disease and danger and the Chinese body. Okay, I'm getting near the end. I want to wrap up, and I want to make some connections explicit to what we're experiencing now in our current pandemic of COVID-19. When I first agreed to give this talk back, I don't know, in June, I did not occur to me that November 3rd was election day. It should have, but it didn't. And so there's probably nothing more relevant right now to talk about the most egregious examples of anti-Asian racism during this pandemic have, of course, stemmed from the US President, Donald Trump, who has repeatedly enforced this racist narrative about the origin of the virus, calling it either the China virus, the Wuhan virus, or maybe most disgustingly, the Kung flu. He has repeatedly threatened China for what they've done. During one of the recent debates, he said, it's not my fault, it's China's fault, right? And everything is about shifting blame onto sort of a foreign enemy. And this is a tale as old as time. It's one of the oldest plays in the book, and Trump has been using it repeatedly. And so one lesson I would suggest what scapegoating can do in the history of epidemics and why it's dangerous is it really deflects responsibility of leaders for ineffective policy responses. It is a very good way to sort of deflect attention away from the fact that you yourself are being quite ineffective in handling the virus, which is something we absolutely see, I don't have to say that, in the Trump administration. This is not to let Canada off the hook. So there has been lots of sort of at first anecdotal evidence and now statistical evidence that show that there has been a marked increase in anti-Asian racism and harassment in Canada since the outbreak of the pandemic. And this is from the latest survey of Stats Canada that showed that there's at least a 30% perceived increase in harassment among Chinese Canadians, followed closely by Korean and Southeast Asian, Filipino and Japanese Canadians. There is also a project called Project 1907. I really encourage you to look at their website. They're named after that race riot of 1907 that I discussed, that is trying to record incidents of racial harassment in Canada after the COVID-19 pandemic. And so far, they've reported at least 120 individual incidents of harassment or racism or violence that were directed at Asian Canadians. So the second lesson of the reasons why scapegoating can be so dangerous is maybe the most obvious, that it results in real, tangible harm to racialized communities, and it shouldn't be acceptable for us. And then the last lesson I want to draw out is that often racial bias sort of muddies the waters and it absolutely undermines ineffective policy response by sort of activating a finger pointing response. And so this has been seen in sort of the greater Toronto area where there's a large number of COVID-19 cases, and Brampton has emerged as one of the COVID-19 hotspots. And many people are blaming sort of the fact that many of the people who live in Brampton are of South Asian origin. They're saying that they are living in too crowded of conditions, that they are traveling back and forth, and therefore they're the ones bringing COVID-19 to Toronto. And this is really missing the point in the picture, that in fact it is a community that A, is more socially and economically disadvantaged, doesn't have the option of necessarily staying home, disproportionately works in service jobs, and maybe most relevant for this conversation, provides the majority of the staff for the Pearson International Airport. So if they are being exposed, it's because their jobs as frontline workers are exposing them. But because people have sort of been fixating on the idea of multi-generational households, instead they're not actually thinking about, well, how do we protect airport workers? Or how do we make sure that people stay home when they're sick, that they have the resources to do so, instead of focusing on ethnic origin. And so that's my third lesson, that racial biases then undermine effective policy responses in such a way that then further harms the marginalized communities that they are targeting. Okay, I think I spoke for about half an hour, so I want to thank everyone for coming today and for listening, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
And you do have questions, Jenna. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen so that we can have a better look at you as you answer questions, because it's very interesting that way. The first one is looking down from Craig Jones, looking downstream 10 to 20 years, are there any post-pandemic trends in the history of pandemics for which we should be preparing ourselves?
So one is the potential of post-viral illness. Now, I'm not a physician, so I don't want to speak too much to this, but after the 1918 pandemic, we did actually see a lot of sort of illnesses that lasted a little bit longer, some sort of neurological consequences of being infected with the virus. There's already some discussion of that with COVID, that there are sort of unexpected what they call long haul symptoms, potentially neurological symptoms that go along with viral infection that might last weeks or months or years. So I guess that would be something to keep an eye out for, that sometimes that the health of those who had been affected by the pandemic actually show up in sort of unexpected ways. In the Spanish flu was actually a viral encephalitis that created all sorts of symptoms that was sort of surged in the 1920s and the 1930s that people assume or sort of predict was caused by widespread viral infection during 1918. So that's less about blame and scapegoating, but that is one thing that I have my eye on as a historian, and I'm a little terrified of.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Another question is, speaking of differential treatment for people, which is, I guess, another way of talking about scapegoating. During the pandemic, many countries used quarantining, and it occurs to me, thinking of an example of this, in Panama. I just happen to know a bunch of people in Panama, and it's very interesting the way that it ended up being the case that class made a difference in terms of how quarantine actually needed to be followed by the people who were being quarantined, also because of how the police would respond to different people with different safe passage and how you buy safe passage. And so that's just an example. I wonder if you could talk more about maybe your sense of whether there's differential treatments or scapegoating going on generally or historically around quarantining, specifically quarantining in pandemics.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't get a chance to mention this, but in the 19th century, with the targeting of Asian immigration, it became a policy in Canada that when ships were coming in to Western ports, that any person of Chinese origin on board, no matter what the status of the ship was or where they were coming from, were immediately strip searched and actually singled out and often quarantined for longer periods of time. There was a quarantine station in San Francisco called Angel Island in the 19th century that was sort of the equivalent to Ellis Island in New York, in which many Asian immigrants were actually detained for very long periods of time upon suspicion that they were carrying disease. One of the ironies here is that China actually had a compulsory smallpox inoculation program where North America did not. So most of the people who were coming to Canada actually would have been inoculated for smallpox and therefore not at all a risk or lesser risk of causing disease. So there were absolutely targeted quarantines. We also know in San Francisco, whenever there was an outbreak of the Bubonic Plague, they would actually sometimes cordon off Chinatown and not let anyone enter or leave for weeks and weeks. And cut those people off from their livelihoods and their ability to get supplies due to fear that the disease might spread out into the city. It never worked because those neighborhoods were not the source of bubonic plague. I see a question further down that we'll talk about how bubonic plague might be transmitted, but sort of closing off Chinatown was not an effective public health strategy in any way. And actually the US Supreme Court in 1900 actually passed a ruling that race-specific quarantine laws were illegal under the US Constitution, that you could not target those of Chinese origin for different types of quarantine practices than you would of white populations.
Wow, fascinating. I wonder if before we take the cholera and bubonic plague origin questions, we could go to the question of can you stop blaming during a pandemic? Or I think the question there is what as a specialist yourself, what would your recommendations be for stopping the kind of scapegoating that your talk was about?
That's a good question. I definitely do not envy public health experts, and we see the ways in which they are now being blamed or really targeted during this pandemic. It's very, very hard to change people's behavior, particularly when they're afraid. So I'd say in sort of COVID-19, I think constantly getting good scientific information out there, countering conspiracy theories as they come up. And this is something that maybe public health has not done a great job about, to really sort of very vocally refute either racially motivated theories. And I do think the Canadian government did a good job of that earlier on with sort of talking about blaming China or Chinese Canadians, being very explicit that they were not to be targeted and they were not to blame for this pandemic. Of course, much less so within the United States. But I think it's just emphasizing what everyone can do, the nature of the transmission of the disease, which does disproportionately impact marginalized communities often, but is not carried in one body more than the other, and to really just focus on the science as much as possible, though I know that it's very, very hard to message those things when people are very, very scared.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Fascinating. Yeah, I just can't stop myself from mentioning I'm just reading the beginning of this fabulous book, which you probably know, and I was struck by the way that Rob Wallace at the beginning is making the case that the naming of the virus should not like cover up the background of where the virus geographically came from. Like his argument, notably with bird flus, that many of them do originate in the equivalent of factory farming for ducks and so forth. And I wonder what you think about that, considering exactly what you're talking about the way that it's so hard to message that I think that's the reason for the WHO to let's say make it harder to know where the origin is in order to stop racist attacks and scapegoating and the like.
Yeah, I think historically there is a large trend of naming diseases after where they first originated, even if it's incorrect, like the Spanish flu. I mean, I am not an epidemiologist, but I am of the opinion that there's no need, and it's actually not probably very good scientific practice to be naming, especially new emerging viruses out of the place they came from, because that is not an exact way to do that. I think COVID-19 reflects its sort of place within a hierarchy of viruses and its relation to other viruses. I just don't think that there's a need to do that. The H1N1 swine flu also arose, from my understanding, from farming of pigs, but it originated in Mexico, right? I think if we're starting to focus too much on China, and you get sort of racist narratives where really it's not that they can't emerge from these sort of practices at the intersection of humans and their environment. That's absolutely where new viruses come from, but it could arise anywhere. I think part of the focus on China is because there is this, my understanding is there's a reservoir of coronaviruses in some of the bat populations there. But the next virus that sweeps the earth could be from anywhere, right? There's no like reason. And I actually think by focusing too much on one region, as opposed to the ways in which we can be prepared for whatever comes our way from wherever, it's actually damaging. It puts blinders on us.
Interesting point about the blinders. The question, a question from Craig Jones again, are you part of any larger collaboration of historians working to draw the most urgent lessons from this experience?
So I am personally not part of any coalition currently, but I actually was working with, so I teach Queen's medical students, and they participated in the very early days of the pandemic. They were taken out of their placements in the hospital. And so we did a reading course together on the history of epidemics. And as part of that course, they actually produced pandemic journals, and they date from about the end of March to mid-April. And even reading them now, it's quite the fascinating experience. And part of my goal of that, I'm reteaching that to medical students this year, is to actually collect pandemic journals from Queen's students of this experience and to deposit them as a collection in the Queen's archive, so that one day a future historian, at least with the local context of Queen's, can do that. There are a lot of really excellent Canadian historians of medicine. My personal research doesn't focus on infectious disease, so that's why I'm not really part of any sort of research collaborations. But Ethel Jones at the University of Manitoba, just fantastic historian of pandemics and of Spanish flu in Canada, has been very active speaking and sort of speaking to the media and using her expertise. And so she's a really fantastic resource, and I think she's working with a lot of other historians.
Fabulous. I wonder if we can take the questions about cholera. Does it still exist? Is there a vaccine for it? Bubonic plague. How does transmission take place actually? Okay,
I'll take those one at a time. So bubonic plague. So I talked about how there's lots of different theories at the time. What we thought of contagion, what we think of contagion now is a kind of a little bit of a different concept in the medieval period. So what's the most interesting to me about the bubonic plague is that our understanding of how that pandemic spread is still evolving constantly. Every time that I've taught a lecture on it, I've had to change my slides on our understanding of the disease. So I think the most popular narrative is that it is a bacteria that is spread by rats. And one of the ironies of public health in the medieval period is many cities actually slaughtered stray dogs and cats en masse because they thought they might carry the disease, which then increased the rat population of many cities. And then rats can definitely carry bubonic plague. It's actually still endemic in North America, especially on the West Coast among squirrel populations. So if you ever find a dead squirrel on the West Coast, don't touch it. And about 6 people in North America a year are still infected with the bubonic plague. So it's definitely still around, but there's now changing understandings that this particular pandemic, and people are using genetic sequencing and modeling, and it's really fascinating that they actually think that there might have been more human to human transmission than previously thought, and that people have sort of been blaming rats for a long time. There's many different forms bubonic plague can take. So that's my understanding as sort of as a historian and not a physician or an amateur virologist. In terms of cholera definitely still exists. There was many outbreaks, I think, in Haiti that are still ongoing. There was a particularly bad cholera outbreak in Haiti after the earthquake there. I think that was back in 2003, but I know there's still recurring outbreaks of cholera. I actually don't know if there's probably not a vaccine for cholera because it is a bacteria. I'm sure there are treatments. I think cholera kills by dehydration. But if there's any physicians on the chat, if they want to put in an answer to that, that's a little bit more exact. But cholera certainly still exists, but it very much shows up often in either war zones or after natural disasters when there is an infection of water supply and a difficulty of getting clean water. I see another comment here from David Walker in the chat, just about blame as it relates to COVID in Kingston being attached to Queen students. I absolutely agree with that, right? You see a lot of sort of panic on social media that the return of the students was going to bring COVID back to the city, that they were going to be irresponsible, that they were going to party. And not that there wasn't like a good public response, public health response to that, but I think there was maybe some unfair assumptions or targeting of students, in my opinion. In that it really hasn't been borne out that there's been sort of large outbreaks among the students in Kingston. But absolutely, it doesn't always have to be racialized. There's I think the other sort of narrative that we see in Canada right now, absolutely, it's blaming Americans. The sort of fear of the American, and it is not that cases of COVID-19 are not very high in the United States, but I've seen accounts in Kingston of cars with American license plates being vandalized and people being yelled at, being told to go home, even if they were a recent migrant to Canada, someone who has Americans in my family, right? Like if someone was coming to visit me, the fact that they could be targeted, right? And that's all just fear-based and sort of wanting people to stay away and fear of the foreign, even if it's close to home.
I will want to quickly add, because so many of my Asian Canadian students or Asian students just experienced horrible situations at the beginning of the pandemic. You know, it's maybe unfortunately not unusual for Queens, and Queens students, I guess, have a bit of a reputation for you know, blackface parties and the like, but definitely sobering to see exactly what you're talking about racism and scapegoating among, you know, a young educated population.
Yeah, and I didn't get a chance to touch on this very much, but one of the other reasons why scapegoating and blame is really a dangerous game is then you create stigma. And I didn't get a chance to really talk about that. People have talked about that a lot in the history of HIV/AIDS, but then you have people being hesitant to seek medical care, to hide the fact that they're sick. This actually happened a lot in the plague outbreak in London in the 17th century, that because the quarantine practices were so strict and so restrictive, people would hide illness in their families to avoid having the entire family being quarantined, because people would attack their house or sort of then refuse to associate with them, right? So there definitely is a stigma related to being infected. And that is a really big public health problem too, because if people aren't willing to get tested or to sort of reveal that they are ill, it's very hard to contact trace. Even happened in Toronto when the strip clubs were open, that people were giving fake names, right? Because they were ashamed and they didn't want to be associated with that. And then it's very hard. So stigma is in many different forms is a big enemy for public health, as I understand it.
It's so fascinating. What an absolutely fascinating talk, and so just such scope, just really so interesting and so important now, as bringing together, you know, the pandemic that we're living with, the pandemic of racism that we're seeing with Black Lives Matter. You know, it's coming to the surface and people are actually talking about it, and your talk brings these topics together at a moment when it's just so very, very important. Also to think about the differential ways in which the pandemic is affecting people depending on their intersectionality and their privilege and power.
Yeah.
So,
and one thing that I didn't get a chance to talk about is what we don't have national figures at the moment, but we do have Toronto specific and Peel specific statistics. And 83% of our confirmed COVID cases in Toronto specifically come from people of color, and they only make up 50% of the population. This is disproportionately affecting racialized populations that are then going to be sort of prone to being blamed, when really there are lots of different socioeconomic reasons the types of jobs that recent immigrants might have. They're the ones who are on the front lines. There's a lot of healthcare workers, and yet they're being sort of singled out for being the sort of sources of infection, when really it's because there aren't policies to protect them in their workplaces. And so it also, as I said, it really muddies the water, and then it further punishes and sort of affects communities that are already disproportionately affected. So there is definitely a racial justice issue here of public health officials really focusing on the racial aspect in order to ensure that Canadians aren't being unfairly harmed.
Wow, very great point. Really, that's really something that we can galvanize around in terms of how we can make a difference in terms of making a change. But going back to the first question of the 10 to 20 years down the line, if we could somehow through education and through messaging and through funding change how the pandemic will be treated on the ground and how people will treat each other in the pandemic when the pandemic hits the ground. There's one more. I'm just seeing. Sorry, because we would have time for just one more question. Just some comments about the first community outbreak was associated with nail salons, which was in Kingston, a nail salon run by an Asian Canadian family, and that had that unfortunate effect of kind of scapegoating, and then yeah. So
I think there was a lot of unfair rhetoric around that, even in local journalism here, either anti-Asian scapegoating, or even you see a lot here, just like Toronto scapegoating, right? Like blame gets very specific and sort of local, have everyone stay out of our region. I know that even happened in Prince Edward County. They didn't want people from Quebec. They didn't want, right? So there's like all these people get very scared and they get worried. And it's much easier to say you're bad, stay away, than to take a look at our own behavior and if we're being as safe and contributing to the public health effort as much as we can. So focusing on what we can control.
Yes, how many people we can just not meet now and just meet later. I can't thank you enough for a fabulous talk. Thank you so much for contributing. I think we all learned a lot. And thank you everyone for coming, and all the best. Wear your mask, be safe, as Amy Goodwin says, and hoping that everything works out well tonight.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.